You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. The streets of Sydney 100 years ago were wide dirt passageways made for horse and cart, not the streamlined blacktop asphalt of today. It was a bustling city, but with barely a fraction of the population that now inhabits it. And the people who called Sydney home back then had gone from sending their fathers, husbands and sons off to the Great War to dealing with the devastating pandemic of the Spanish flu that wiped out entire families, into the era of the Great Depression, leaving men without work and women struggling to maintain households with barely a penny to get by. It's a time where Sydney's notorious razor gangs led by Tilly Devine and Kate Lee battled for control of the criminal underworld, spreading terror through the Sydney suburbs of Darlinghurst, Woolloomooloo and King's Cross. Where the hopes of a nation hung on the saddle of one mighty horse Phar Lap, and where lost people went missing as they tried to survive an economic turmoil that left them homeless and hopeless. In amongst all that were a group of men tasked with solving not just all the homicides in Sydney, but across the entire state of New South Wales, piecing together crimes with sometimes nothing more than a locker key as evidence. They would come to be known as the Murder Squad. The Murder Squad manually compared thousands of fingerprints from physical card databases, travelled hundreds of kilometres without cars, phones or radios to communicate as they knocked on doors and piece by piece put together a story of a victim's final days, hours, moments. From the eternal mystery of the Pyjama Girl, the woman whose badly burned body was found in a ditch and placed on display, hoping someone would reveal her identity, to the couple who went parking one night and never returned, ending up in a massive manhunt that would lead investigators across the newly opened Harbour Bridge. And the man whose water-soaked hand floated back into sight of police and miraculously identified its owner, the Murder Squad would find ways to solve cases that defy belief. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's guest, journalist Michael Adams, has detailed these investigations in his new book, The Murder Squad. He joins us now. So, Michael, can you transport us back for a moment to Australia of the 1920s? There's obviously the Great Depression, which is having quite a lot of influence, not just in the US where it's occurring, but across the globe. What does Australia look like in the 1920s and 30s?
It's a very, very different landscape. I mean, just physically writing this book, I had to actually look at photographs to remind myself to, put away the ideas of Sydney and New South Wales that I have in my head from growing up here. The streets are often very wide, dirt, bare. There's not that many cars because, while cars started to be purchased in greater numbers in the 1920s, as soon as the Great Depression hit in 1929, car ownership went backwards. People didn't buy new clothes a lot, so people often are sort of, wearing clothes that are quite worn. People would mend things. While you've got, things like billboards and signage, the streets compared to our streets are very, very bare. The houses are simpler, the buildings are simpler, and obviously, there's very few buildings approaching anything like a skyscraper. I mean, your tallest building might be, 120 feet tall. So it's just a really different physical landscape. There's 1.25 million people living in Sydney at the time, as opposed to, 5.5 million now. So there's patches of bush, sort of even in inner suburbs. There's lots of vacant houses, vacant buildings. We would probably think of it as a bit of a post-apocalyptic landscape in some areas. Then, of course, in the inner city, there's vibrant sort of, nightclubs, cafes, pubs, even though they're only open till 6 p.m. So it's a real mixture, but it's a very different landscape. People dress as well as they can. And for men, that means, a suit, possibly a vest, a tie, a hat. You wouldn't go out without a hat unless you were a real thug. And women are also, wearing dresses and skirts. Even people who are on the bones of their ass in the Depression wear, the best suits that they can. So it's a really different world. And that's sort of something I find quite fascinating because, it's not like ancient Rome. It's less than 100 years ago. Similar, but very different.
I guess it's worth a mention too that in the background of all of this, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is under construction.
Absolutely. I mean, from 1923 onwards, you've got these two arches which are joining over the sky of the harbour. We look at the Sydney Harbour Bridge now and it's impressive. Back then, as I said, the tallest building was 120 feet tall. This thing towers out of all proportion to the rest of Sydney. And there's also the question of, is it going to meet? I mean, that was a big sort of worry that, the two arches would not meet. They'd collapse into the harbour. And if they collapsed into the harbour, they would then block the harbour. So it would be, a devastating outcome. It'd be pretty hard to raise that much iron and steel. So yeah, you've got the Sydney Harbour Bridge being built. The Depression also created a changed political landscape. I mean, there were already timber workers and coal miners who had been locked out, and they were in a really sort of full-on conflict with the state government and with the police. So, there were basher squads of police that would raid timber workers and, beat them up. And the same on the northern coalfields. So you've got this sort of industrial unrest. Then the actual Depression starts for real. And you've got the rise of the New Guard from early 1931. These were quasi-fascists who wanted to overthrow Jack Lang's Labor government. Then you've also got, technological sort of breakthroughs. The ABC starts broadcasting in July of 1932. Suddenly the pictures are talking and they're making talking pictures in Australia. They've got newsreels that talk. Some of the murder cases in the book featured the very first times that the police actually made appeals to the public via a newsreel with sound. And of course, you've also then got Phar Lap and Bodyline, two of the iconic sort of sporting legends in Australian history, also happening in this period. So that's what I love about it. It's this really dramatic mix of, politics, economics, sport, and of course, crime.
We kind of touched on it there momentarily about the state of policing in New South Wales in the 20s and 30s. And in your book, you kind of describe it like we're shifting just out of the bushranger days into a time where we're starting to use a little bit more technology, but it's still pretty rudimentary. What does policing look like during this time?
Exactly right. The cops that were on the beats at this time, it was the dead hand of seniority where, you would progress through the ranks according to your age and the amount of time you'd been in the force. It was very rare to be a really good cop and advance quickly. So a lot of these guys, by the time they made detective sergeant, had been cops for 20 years or even more. So they'd come up literally in the days of bushrangers and everybody working on horses, that sort of thing, Detective Sergeant Thomas McRae, he started out at Cooma in 1912 as a young cop, a young beat cop. They had no car. There was only one car in the entire police force at that time, and it was for the use of the Inspector General, later the Commissioner, in Sydney. In 1912, Cooma Police Station didn't have a telephone. You would get a telegram or someone would come in and say, hey, there's been a crime. You'd jump on your horse or you'd get your horse and sulky or you'd walk to the crime scene. And any correspondence that you had to conduct with other stations or the CIB in Sydney was done via letter or via telegram. And by the 1930s, that had obviously started to change, but it was still pretty rudimentary. There were telephones in most stations in the city by that stage, but there were very few cars. And the cars that did exist, very few of those had radios. So, it made coordination over any sort of distance quite difficult. There was a case in 1932 where a murderer was spotted and the policeman had to get a bus to the scene to interview a witness. And by the time he got there and then determined that, this witness was credible and made a call to the CIB and they sent men, the murderer had a 2-hour head start. And that was in Bankstown. So that was, close to the centre of the city. So, it was a very, very different landscape, but they were making improvements. The boss of the CIB at that time was a very fiery Scotsman called Billy Mackay, and he'd instituted some reforms that included basically streamlined filing procedures and what we'd consider sort of forensic analysis of data, so that, you know, if they heard of a crime that involved a break and enter, they could very quickly pull all the files, and these were physical files, all of those files that related to people who'd been convicted or suspected of those crimes. They made sure that they were getting mugshots so they could then show them to witnesses and narrow down their suspect pool. Things like fingerprinting by that stage were relatively advanced, but again, all physical. You know, you'd take a fingerprint and then you'd have to physically match it to what you had on record. And by the early 1930s, they had a couple of 100,000 prints on file. So again, just a really, by our standards, primitive but developing sort of policing.
And during this time too is when they started to look into things like ballistics and starting to really match up bullets with guns too, right?
Yeah, some of the cases in the book from the late 20s and early 30s were the first instances in New South Wales, and I think in Australia, of police being able to match bullets to guns that had been fired. And this was, you know, Billy Mackay had been in the UK and the US in 1929 and 1930, and he'd observed new policing technologies over there, and this was one of them. And it was very exciting. You know, it was like, oh my God, a bullet can be like a fingerprint. You know, if we can match the gun, we've got the murderer. In the book, there are a couple of cases where they did exactly that. They proved that the gun that had been handed in, taken into custody from a suspect, was the gun that had fired the fatal shot. And, you know, when a suspect is confronted with that information, it's pretty hard to deny. So they could then get a confession. So the actual ballistics, while they'd been executed, are vital for the convictions because they had other evidence. But yeah, that was a major breakthrough in policing at the time.
So policing is coming through a time of transition and change. At the same time, the world has gone through massive changes. We're coming off the back of the Great War. We've dealt with a pandemic, something we're all familiar with nowadays, but the Spanish flu was in pandemic during the time preceding that. And then comes the Great Depression. And with all of that back to back to back, what impact does that have on the crime rate here in Australia?
It's difficult to say exactly. I was focusing on murders, and I know that in 1932, which was the peak year of the Great Depression, the murder rate in New South Wales, the previous 3 years, there'd been an average of 26. That year, there was 36. So it seems to be a significant jump. Certainly at the time, it was perceived to be a quote-unquote murder wave, and they were wondering whether it was to do with the desperation of the time, because a lot of the crimes weren't necessarily motivated by monetary motives. They seemed to be quite random and quite vicious. So they were wondering whether people were losing it, I guess, to some extent. They also floated theories that it might be something to do with sunspots. So they really didn't have, you know, the greatest idea. It did seem that in terms of violent crime, there was a spike. Certainly, one of the troubling things that I would come across quite frequently were suicides. And back in the day, the reporting of suicides was very different to today. They were starting to get the idea that there was, you know, a copycat syndrome, but they were still reporting, you know, all of the details. They'd published the details of the suicide victim's note as well. So you can actually read why they did it. And oftentimes it would be, I can't face the shame of going onto the dole. I've lost my home, I've lost my job, and so forth. I mean, one of the great things of 1930s Australia was the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, famously usurped by the New Guard fascist crank Francis de Groot, who was pulled off his horse by Billy Mackay, the police chief I'm talking about. What's less remembered is that on the 24th of April, so 5 weeks later, the first person jumped from the bridge. And then the next day, someone else did on Anzac Day. And they went, okay, well, maybe we need to have an anti-suicide fence. But it took them 18 months to build one. And in that time, 44 people went over the edge. And I think that is indicative of the despair that people were feeling. I mean, obviously, there was a lot of camaraderie at the time as well. You know, people pulled together. Some of the cases that I cover in the book were regional and rural. So, you know, I did a fair bit of reading of newspapers at the time about conditions on the Wallaby Trap, which is, you know, tens of thousands of men and some of their wives and families took to the bush in hope of finding work, doing farming, whatever. And they ended up unemployed, tramping from town to town where they'd get their dole and then be told to, you know, move on. And when you think of the dole, as you know, being paid some money, back then it was food rations. You know, you'd get X amount of rations for this, that, and the other, which you could then redeem at the local shop. And sometimes they would, be charging exorbitant amounts, so your rations didn't go as far, and then on you went. So there really was, a very difficult time for a lot of Australians.
I'd like to touch on that desperation angle that you just discussed then to talk about the first of many, many cases that you cover in this book, and they're all incredibly fascinating in their own right. But this one really struck me with that real desperation that people at the time must have been feeling, because it's November 1931 and a farmer comes across human remains in the remains of a bonfire or a campfire. And this also harks to the incredible policing work that goes into identifying remains that have been burnt so bad there's literally just a few bones left in a time where there's no forensic computing, there's no DNA matching. Can you talk us through exactly what was found in the fire at Bungendore?
Absolutely. So Bungendore's outside of Goulburn. A farmer came across the remains of a bonfire, and in the remains of these ashes saw what looked like bits of a human skull and other bones, which proved to be the case. That was all that was left of whoever was there, along with, a few things that hadn't burned in the fire, one of which was the steel barrel of a gun. The rest of it had burned up. There were no bullets because they're lead, they melt. There were a few other bits and pieces, including a locker key, the remains of a watch, a few coins. And Tom McRae, who by that stage had proved himself in a few other similarly mysterious cases, was called down to assist the local police, which was the procedure at the time. First of all, they had to establish, when this fire had happened. So they turned to an Indigenous tracker that Tom McRae had worked with previously, and he saw that the logs that had been dragged to create the bonfire had left ruts, and grass had grown up in those ruts. And he could say that, okay, well, that grass is 4 to 5 weeks old. So that gives you the date of the fire. So then McRae, who had worked in the area as a beat constable after he'd worked at Cooma, canvassed witnesses who remember seeing a fire. And people said, yeah, we remember one sort of at the end of October. It was pretty big. So then it was, okay, well, who possibly was this? There were no cans, there were no bottles, so it didn't seem like it had been a swaggies camp. They thought maybe it had been two swaggies. One had beaten the other and pushed him into their bonfire. That was kind of ruled out. The bones were assessed in Goulburn by the medical examiner, but then they were also sent to Sydney University where an anatomy expert examined them, and he said that he believed that they were from a young man, maybe 21, who stood about 6 feet tall. So that, again, not much to work with. There were rumours, or there were stories, reports about two blokes who'd been in the area at the time, possibly fossicking for gold, possibly looking for work. One was described as a city bloke, the other kind of more of a country character. Again, not a lot to go on. But they had the key, and this key was a locker key. So McRae went to Billy Mackay, his superior, and to the commissioner and said, there's a mark on this key called Vaughan. It's a trademark. Let's try and trace it. So the Vaughan keys had been made in England in 1929, and they liaised with Scotland Yard to discover this and got the records of the consignment. It had been part of a consignment of thousands of keys that had been shipped out to England 2-3 years earlier. So they got the list of all the companies that had bought these keys, and they started pounding the pavement. They visited scores and scores and scores of businesses, clubs, and so forth. And eventually it paid off. They actually found the locker at the YMCA, opened the locker, and they had the guy's identity. So who'd killed him? And the thing was, the family was sure he'd been murdered. But what seemed really strange was that this guy had died in this fire, supposedly, but the gun was also in the fire. So, if you were going to shoot someone and then throw the gun into the fire to dispose of the murder weapon, you would know that the gun barrel is not going to melt. You could actually just take the gun and just throw it into a wombat hole and it would never be found. So McRae's theory was that this guy had actually killed himself. He'd created a bonfire, he'd stood on it, he'd set it alight, and he'd shot himself. The idea being that his remains would be completely cremated. He would just vanish from the face of the earth. And you've got to remember that, in this part of history, suicide was a shameful thing, shameful for you, very shameful for your family. And when McRae actually started to investigate, he became more and more convinced that this was the case. But the family was really angry with this conclusion. They did not want to hear this. They actually engaged a lawyer at the inquest to argue that it was very likely their son had been murdered. By this stage, though, the family had actually been interviewed individually and had said that, yes, this guy was depressed. He'd suffered a head injury. He'd talked about his life being worthless. McRae had found his psychiatrist who testified he'd been seeing him regularly, and he'd expressed sort of what we would now call suicidal ideation. The guy had disappeared a week before the bonfire, and he'd also had a .22 rifle, very similar to the one that had been found in the fire. The coroner ruled it was an open verdict, so that there was not enough evidence to say it was murder and not enough evidence to say it was suicide. That pleased the family. You can kind of think that McRae probably, having worked on this case so extensively, he drove 1,200 miles in the space of a few weeks around the Goulburn area, virtually interviewing everyone who lived there to try and determine what had happened, only for the family to not want this suicide verdict to come through. So he might have been pretty disappointed by the outcome. But the thing was that everybody was astounded by the fact that he'd managed to identify this guy in the first place, and that really made his reputation as a homicide cop, even though it wasn't a homicide. And this guy who'd killed himself had actually lost his job weeks beforehand. And you do find this repeatedly where the criminals, all the suicide victims, have had this dislocation, this disruption to their lives that you could trace back to the Depression.
Let's fast forward a little bit to April 1932. And this particular case really highlighted the role that the media often played alongside police in murder investigations and the wild inaccuracies that they were allowed to report during investigations, as you've already touched on what they could mention when people took their own lives. But it's April 1932 and Frank Wilkinson picks up his girl, Dorothy Denzel, in his car. They're going to go parking, but they never return. And a massive manhunt ensues, and the newspaper articles that flow from that leave the Australian public truly terrified.
This was one of the most shocking cases because of the brutality, but also just the randomness. And it didn't seem that there was much of a motive. So Dorothy and Frank went for a drive. As you say, they didn't return. Immediately the next morning, their families were worried. They were worried because these young people were considered to be well-balanced. They were both employed. They were very close to their families. They spoke to their families all the time. It was totally out of character for them to not come home to their respective beds. So the families immediately feared the worst. There was a massive search undertaken for them. At the same time, various witnesses came forward that sort of put a known criminal, who was a very distinctive-looking guy, William Moxley, at the scene. And the car they'd been driving was found a couple of days later, and this guy had apparently been selling parts. He went to ground. Now, at the time, weirdly, the police would not release the names of suspects to the newspapers, initially at least. So, the public knew that there was a known criminal police wanted to talk to in relation to this disappearance, but they didn't know what he looked like, who he was, what his name was, or what his aliases were. Sadly, Frank and Dorothy were found a day apart. Both of them were buried face down in shallow graves. They'd been terribly battered. They'd been killed with shotgun blasts to the face or to the back of their head. Dorothy, they believed, had been sexually assaulted, though at the time that was speculative, whereas today it would be far easier to determine via DNA whether she'd actually had sex with her boyfriend before death or whether she'd been sexually assaulted by somebody else. In any event, the manhunt was humongous, and it was centred on southwestern Sydney. That's where they were found, near Liverpool. Initially, there's 100 police, then there's 200 police, then there's hundreds or possibly thousands of men and boys. They're unemployed. They're living in fear that there's a maniac in their neighbourhood. They've got nothing else to do. So they're out in the countryside armed with, whatever comes to hand, looking for this guy. One of the headlines was "Terror Reigns," and it said you'd be a fool at the moment to walk around the Liverpool Bankstown area of a night time without good cause because, you might end up getting shot by some of these vigilantes. And then the police did actually make a talkie appeal. They took the unusual step of naming William Moxley as the suspect, the man that was, suspected of committing these crimes. His photo was in the newspapers. He was described in a newsreel, a talkie newsreel. He'd been seen here and there, including by someone who then had phoned it in, only for the police to have to attend by bus, letting Moxley get away again. Once he'd been identified, the newspapers then made all sorts of speculations, which today would just be, he hadn't been charged, I guess, so it wasn't sub judice, but in terms of prejudicing a fair trial, calling a bloke a human gorilla and having caricatures of him where he looks like a monster in the bush is pretty hardcore. The newspapers also published his prior criminal history, which was pretty extensive, but did not include violent crime. And this is the other thing. Previously in a manhunt like this, in southwestern Sydney, you'd be to some extent boxed in on that side of the harbour. But this crime had been committed 2 weeks after the Sydney Harbour Bridge had opened. So Moxley traipsed through the bush, managed to evade all of the police looking for him, stole a bicycle and rode it across the Sydney Harbour Bridge to the North Shore, where he holed up in the bush. He was eventually spotted. He was spotted by a citizen. That was one of the benefits of having his photo in the newspapers and on the newsreels and in wanted posters put up all over the place. Someone spotted him, even though he'd tried to sort of dye his hair using grease from the bike chain. They saw him going back into his bush hideout. They called the cops. There was a bit of a chase. They grabbed him and he was hauled into the CIB. Now, what the public didn't know was that he had for a long time been Billy Mackay, the chief of police's confidential informant. He'd actually been shot and nearly killed 2 years earlier for being a snitch, for being a fizz gig, as they used to call it. So there was this really complex interplay of like the top cop and his informant, who's now suspected of and confessing to, or basically confessing to, a double murder. The police had to tread very carefully in how this was handled. It certainly wasn't made public that he'd been on the police payroll. His story was that he could remember everything up to actually supposedly killing them. He claimed that there was someone else there. This person, strangely enough, looked exactly like him, had the same nickname. It would seem to me that he had been a victim of severe trauma, including getting shot in the head 2 years earlier, and he'd had a litany of other problems. As a child, he'd accidentally shot and killed his brother, for instance. That's got to leave you fairly traumatized. So it would seem that he had actually killed them in a dissociative state. He did confess to bailing them up and robbing them and having a fight with Frank. After that, he said he couldn't remember anything. As for motive, at the time, as a known police informant, that had been in the newspapers 2 years earlier. If he'd been convicted of, robbery and assault and gone to jail for 10 years, that very likely would have been a death sentence as a known police informer. So that was a potential motive for him to actually leave no witnesses. It's a really troubling case, though, because, the death penalty was in effect because Jack Lang, the New South Wales Premier, who was Labor, had been sacked and he'd been replaced by the Nationalists or the United Australia Party, and they were pro-death penalty. His life depended on these sort of very arcane political manoeuvrings, and in the end, he was hanged.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with author Michael Adams about an elite group of detectives known as the Murder Squad, who were tasked with solving major crimes and homicides across New South Wales in the 1920s and 30s. Skipping a year away from the Moxley case, this is an example of very basic beginnings of forensics, which you could almost just shake your head in disbelief that they were able to do these things in the 1930s. Christmas Day, 1933, there's a couple of guys fishing on the Murrumbidgee River. They notice a really bad smell. They see something stuck in some branches and they realise that it's the backside of an adult man whose top half is inside a chaff sack submerged in the water. And this would lead to an absolutely incredible fingerprinting process. Can you talk me through the human glove case?
I can. It is just the most bizarre case. And it's strange that given the shark arm murder and the Pyjama Girl, reasonably well known from the same period, that this one, for whatever reason, is almost completely forgotten. So, yeah, they find this decomposing corpse in the Murrumbidgee River. It's hot. The guy's kind of porridge, basically. Bits of him are sort of like sloughing off as they bring him to shore. This is at Wagga Wagga. So the local cop there, Sergeant Ramus, he's a skilled cop. This is his first homicide investigation, at least that I could find. So they call McRae down from Sydney. He gets there with his partner who also had worked on the Bungendore case. They inspect the body. The face is completely caved in. There's no identifying features whatsoever. And the skin on both hands is gone. There's a little bit of a scrap of skin on the left thumb. Otherwise, it's just gone. And on the right hand, it's completely gone. So no fingerprinting is going to be likely. They're going to try and get something off the left thumb, but it's very, very unlikely. So, of course, McRae needs to actually see the site where the body was found. And he and Ramus and the constable go to the site. And while they're there diving to see if there's any evidence, they find a human glove, half in, half out of the water on the shore. So this is the entire epidermis of the guy's right hand. McRae, in the files that I managed to access, his assumption was that the man was wearing a tunic, which was the sort of tunic that was issued to the unemployed, and they were quite tight. So as this guy's body had become swollen with decomposition, the tunic had cut into the wrist, both wrists, but this one in particular, to the point where the entire hand skin came away. So they had this human glove, this sort of floppy, half dry, half wet, parchmenty thing. They packed it in cotton wool and they sent it to Sydney. All of this was in the press as it was happening. So the Sun newspaper would send reporters with the police down to these locations. So you can see photographs of them, inspecting the evidence that they'd found in the back of the lockup and at the crime scene and all of this stuff. So New South Wales and Australia, I guess, was waiting with bated breath to see whether it would be possible to fingerprint this thing. The fingerprint expert in Sydney initially could not do much with it because it was dried out. It was like parchment. So he softened it with, I guess, like lanolin or something like that. But then it was too floppy to print. So strong stomach, this guy, and clearly small hands, he actually lubricated his hand and put his hand inside the human glove. And then he fingerprinted it. And it was reported, I would assume quite accurately, as a world forensic first. And amazingly enough, the prints were matched within 3 hours to a man who had been on the dole, and they could trace him. He'd been arrested and charged a couple of times with getting rations under false pretenses in the Riverina region. But once they knew his name, they could also trace where he'd been in the Riverina receiving dole rations for the past few years. His name was Percy Smith, and he was from Victoria. And he had a very distinctive wagon, horses, couple of dogs. He had long dark hair. So he was a very distinctive looking guy, and he was remembered by the police who dealt with him. So yeah, over the next week or so, McRae and Ramus and other police traced this guy's movements, interviewed people who'd seen him. They all said they'd seen him in the company of this guy who was well known in the area, Edward Morey. Edward Morey had actually just been released from jail after a 2-week stint for drunkenness. They picked him up. He denied everything, but they eventually built a lock-solid case, an amazing case of circumstantial, a chain of evidence that just put this guy in the spotlight. And he was tried and convicted. Obviously, the police can't release the details of people's prior convictions before a conviction for the crime in question. Once he was convicted, I saw a memo that McRae had written to the government when they were considering whether to commute his death sentence, and it sort of stipulated all of the crimes he'd committed, including these previous bashings where he'd cracked people over their head when he was drunk to rob them, exactly what had happened with this Percy Smith guy. In this case, the government did commute his death sentence to life in prison, but he would be released 20 years later on compassionate grounds because he had tuberculosis. Then he reoffended and went back in for the rest of his life.
Can we just reverse for a little bit? You talked about the incredible chain of evidence that they put together to finally catch Ted Morey, because they found his wagon eventually, which was sold through an auction house, and the guy who bought it did actually find Percy's doll cards wedged in by the canvas, and they managed to trace it all the way back to Maury.
That's right. Maury had caved this guy's head in, put him in a chaff sack, chucked him in the Murrumbidgee, then taken his horse, his cart, his dogs, all of his possessions back to Wagga Wagga and sold them to this local guy. He'd sold some of the possessions directly and some through an auction house. And this guy, who was a horse trader, had bought this, wagon, hadn't thought too much of it, had only driven it back to his house, and they had found a dole card in the wagon in the name of Percy Smith and thought nothing of it until Percy Smith's name was in the newspaper as the murder victim. Then he and his son went and had a closer look at the horse cart, and there was blood that had dripped through the sort of false floor in the back of the thing. So he, oh my God, took the cart, the horse, other possessions to the police and said, I bought these from Ted Maury. And Ted Maury had, as I said, literally that morning just been released from the lockup. So they just went and picked him up. And one of the fascinating things about this story, it reveals so much about conditions at the time. Where they went to pick him up was a place called Tent Town in Wagga Wagga, which is exactly what it sounds like, a shanty town, a tent town where the unemployed lived. And Maury had gone there to see one of his kin, and that's where he was picked up. And later, when there was another murder related to the case, it also happened in Tent Town. So it just gives you this insight of, a very, very different world to the one we live in.
You've already mentioned this case, and it would be remiss of us not to touch on it while we have you, because it is one of the most enduring mysteries of Australian crimes past, and that is Pyjama Girl. It's September 1934, and a farmer is walking his prize bull back from the show when he happens to look down into a culvert where he sees something pretty shocking. The body of a woman dressed in distinctive yellow silk pyjamas with a Chinese dragon embroidered onto the material. What do we know about Pyjama Girl?
Yes, this Pyjama Girl was found in a culvert, in a sack, bent over sort of double. She'd been beaten. The sack had been set on fire, but her face had been wrapped in a towel. So while her legs and torso were somewhat scorched, her lower feet were really burned up, but her face was relatively intact despite the injuries. She was distinctive looking. They believed she might have been a model or an actress. They thought she was a city girl because of her haircut. She was called the Pyjama Girl because when she'd been killed and disposed of, she'd been wearing these Chinese-style pyjamas, and there were still fragments of them that were extant on the body. And they were able to determine that it was a specific type of pyjama that had been imported from China, from Hong Kong, and they'd been imported in quite large numbers, so they weren't necessarily a rare item, but they had a distinctive sort of dragon-style pattern on them. So that image of those pyjamas was put in all the newspapers, hence the name the Pyjama Girl. So, this was a case where, compared to the Bungendore Bones or the human glove, they had a hell of a lot to work with. What they also found in the autopsy, although this was not made public, and it was not made public to screen out cranks, was that she'd been shot just below the eye. This bullet had then deflected down into her neck. Despite that, it wasn't the actual fatal injury. So she'd been shot, but her skull had also been fractured, and that skull fracture was what had killed her. So her body was taken to the Albury morgue, and it was put on ice. McRae, who'd been up in Wagga Wagga finishing up this other murder case related to the human glove, was brought down to supervise the investigation. The body was on ice, so locals could come in and see her. I mean, I just can't even think about how grotesque that is, but see her there. Do you know her? No, they don't. At first it's dozens, then it's hundreds of people. None of them know her. Really photorealistic illustrations taken from post-mortem photographs were published in the newspapers all over Australia. This was a huge case. I mean, the Pyjama Girl, as a sort of catchphrase or whatever you'd call it, was used within 24 hours, and that was what she was known as. So, people had a description of her age, her appearance, they had images. Then there were actually circulars sent around to various police with actual post-mortem photographs. But no one came forward I mean, there were hundreds of missing persons reports, hundreds of wives, girlfriends, sisters, aunts, nieces who'd gone missing. These were individually traced and ruled out, and they just could not identify her. They took dental records. Unfortunately, these dental records were a bit skew if they wouldn't know this at the time. These dental records and all the information they had was sent to police all over the world. They had her fingerprints. They had so much. Someone had to have missed this woman, but no one could come forward to identify her. After about a week, even though she was on ice, she was starting to contort and to decompose. There was a suggestion that they decapitate her and put her head in a jar of formalin for people to identify. Now, McRae had been on the human glove case, and that human glove had been in a jar of formalin in court every day, and it was super gnarly. So he quite rightly suggested that there was another way, and that was to embalm the Pyjama Girl. So that's what they did. They got Kinsellas down from Sydney. They were sort of, the funeral experts in Australia. They came down, and in a lengthy operation, they embalmed the Pyjama Girl. They still kept her on ice in Albury to make sure that the preservation was as good as possible for another few weeks, but no one identified her. So they took her up then to Sydney University, and they put her into basically a coffin, zinc-lined, filled with formalin to preserve her. There was a collar around her neck so she could be fished out of this fluid to present to people who might be able to identify her in the future. And that's where she would remain for the next 10 years. Eventually, the case was, quote unquote, solved by Billy Mackay, the police boss who, it would seem, got a confession out of a man he knew. And this man he knew, Agostini, would seem to have actually killed his wife around about the same time. And he had dumped the body, but he didn't know where. But he consistently denied that the Pyjama Girl was his wife. In any event, he went to trial and he was convicted of manslaughter, and he only got 6 years and was released after 4, and then he was deported. So this one tidied up the case, but, as the historian Richard Evans has so adroitly pointed out in his studies of the Pyjama Girl and of Billy Mackay, it didn't tally. The Pyjama Girl's eyes were a different colour to the eyes of Linda Agostini, the woman who was finally identified as being her. So it really does seem that it's a unsolved case, and it was tucked away by Billy Mackay, who wanted it off the books.
What was it like for these guys who you've mentioned throughout this conversation, who investigated all of these murders? They are collectively referred to as the Murder Squad. What was this time like for them, with so many cases to investigate, still in this time where, there's not even a phone at every police station yet, and yet they're managing to somehow crack these cases the majority of the time? What was it like for them, and how did they end up after all of this?
I'm speculating here because there are very few records. I mean, there are very basic police files for these guys, but, I'm talking very basic, joined, age, height, that sort of stuff. You can intuit bits and pieces, but retrospectively applying what we know about things like trauma and stress and anxiety. McRae, as an example, attended, I'm saying, hundreds of murder scenes over his career, a lot of suicides, accidents. And, your therapy was buck up, mate, go to the pub, have a ciggy, get over it. I mean, this was the sort of mindset at the time. And as you've said, the 1930s, it is fascinating to me because it is a society that's come out of the Holocaust of the Great War, then the Spanish flu, now the Great Depression, and little do they know that World War II and the actual Holocaust and atomic warfare is just on the horizon. So it's this sort of, tense period of all this horrible stuff's already happened. A whole bunch more is happening, and there's still worse to come. My thinking is that they drank a lot. They probably were very stressed and suffering PTSD. Not that it would have been acknowledged at the time. It was a rare thing for these cops to live to old age. Like Billy Mackay dropped dead. I think he was about 60. He was a heavy drinker, a smoker, one of the other inspectors who's all through the murder squad, a guy named Pryor, similarly dropped dead. McRae himself made it to 71, dropped dead of a heart attack at a golf function. So my thinking is it was very difficult for these guys. I mean, they were under a lot of pressure. They also knew there were shortcuts. And this is the thing that's troubling, is that I get you into a police interrogation room and I come out with a statement you've made. There's no independent witness other than my police partner that you said this stuff. It can then go in front of a judge. Your defender, your legal defender, can say it was made under duress or fabricated. The judge can then assess it and decide whether or not it can be admitted into evidence. If it is admitted into evidence, then it's up to a jury to decide whether they believe the accused or believe the police. Obviously, it's weighted in the favour of the police, but it didn't always work out that way. I mean, there are plenty of times juries didn't convict or they convicted on far lesser charges. So it is a murky period. I don't think these cops were always straight. There was a burgeoning culture of corruption, which would obviously come to fruition later in the century. I don't think, however, in the cases of murder, they'd be as likely to stitch people up. I mean, clearly they would like to solve them, but it's a big thing to sort of frame someone who may hang just to get it off your books. And if you were going to do that, you'd probably do it all of the time. And there are numerous cases in the murder squad where, you know, a suspect will confess to one thing but not to another. And if that was the case, you know, if they were framing them, they would have had them confess to everything. And there were a lot of really high-profile cases. These cases went into the homes of the wealthy, which were never solved, where they could have actually used fake confessions to get themselves further along. So, like I say, it's a murky world. The upshot being, I think these cops were under a lot of pressure. Like in 1932 in New South Wales, there were 36 murders, but the police strength was about 1/3 of what it is now. So per capita, there were close to twice the number of murders we have today, with maybe 1/3 to 1/2 of the number of police investigating them. And those police were also dealing with things like, you know, the new guard and handing out dole rations, because that was also on the police, and a whole host of other things. And they were also investigating these crimes, as we've discussed, with very limited resources, and even resources that had been put on the table, like fast cars with wireless radios, were on the back burner because they couldn't afford anything. Like, funds were limited. The New South Wales government, that was the reason that Jack Lang was sacked, was because over the response to the Depression. The pressure was to cut spending, and that included the police. So, you know, the investigative tools that they might have had earlier were delayed because of the Depression. So all in all, I think it would have been a fairly stressful job, fairly thankless as well. They were, however, sort of minor celebrities. So, you know, they could probably walk into some pubs and get, you know, shouted around to beers by the locals. But, you know, that night you'd still go home, I guess, to your bottle of takeaway beer and possibly to your nightmares.
Thanks to Michael for assisting us to tell this story. His book, The Murder Squad, is linked in our show notes if you'd like to learn more. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Claire Murphy, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.